Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry, let's do that big job right. Just get in step with the guy that's hep, get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shin. Back in 1952, Ike for President became the very first political advertisement on TV. The ad was a minute long and featured not only the memorable jingle you're hearing right now, but also a bouncing Ike campaign button, Uncle Sam, a circus elephant, and a whole lot more. Dwight Eisenhower's campaign may have been the first to use television like this, but it's certainly not the last. Today, more than 70 years later, political ads are everywhere. On our TV screens, yes, but also on social media platforms. And in recent weeks, both the Kamala Harris and Donald Trump campaigns have ramped up their advertising.
But Donald Trump wants to take our country backward, to give tax breaks to billionaires and big corporations and end the Affordable Care Act. But we are not going back.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Under Harris, over 10 million illegally here. 250,000 Americans dead from fentanyl. Brutal migrant crimes. And ISIS now here. Kamala Harris failed, weak, dangerously liberal.
This hour, we're diving deep into political advertising during the 2024 election cycle, from the messages we're seeing to how that impacts what we do at the ballot box. Erica Franklin Fowler of the Wesleyan Media Project will answer our questions and yours, and later she'll give us some advice for improving our media literacy skills. Erica, welcome to the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And for our listeners, let us know if you're being flooded with ads for Harris or for Trump. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Erica, before we get into some of the ads that we're seeing right now, tell us a little bit more about the Wesleyan Media Project and the work that you do. Why study political advertising?
Sure. Yeah. So the Wesleyan Media Project has been around since 2010 at Wesleyan. It existed in a prior format. We actually have data from the Wisconsin Advertising Project that goes back to 2000. So we have over 20 years of data at this point that we can compare on elections. Our central goal is to provide more transparency in political spending and specifically campaign advertising, because we don't always know where the money is coming from and what the issues are, especially are being discussed across the country. So our goal is to help citizens understand the context. We can compare this cycle to last cycle and talk about the issues that are popping up most for citizens or for campaigns, and talk about differences in tone or other things between candidates and outside groups.
So did you mention that it was for transparency in spending that prompted the project?
Yeah, exactly. And the Wesleyan iteration of it really popped up after Citizens United. So the Wisconsin Advertising Project was winding down, and the director there talked to us. We were former graduate students of his about potentially taking up the mantle. And it was February, I think, of 2010 when we had the conversation about, do we take it over this year, or do we try for the presidential cycle in 2012? And it seemed like such a shame not to try to get it off the ground in 2010, since it was the first cycle after Citizens United. So tracking the ads is obviously super important to do. So
we definitely want to go into detail about all of those elements, but also would love to know, how much influence does political advertising have on American democracy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will say first that I think political advertising generally tends to take people oversubscribe effects to it. So messaging certainly matters, and political advertising matters. But as my advisor used to say, political advertising matters at the margin. That doesn't mean the margin doesn't matter. And you can ask Al Gore or Hillary Clinton about, the margin. But I think that figuring out when and where and under what conditions political advertising are likely to matter is one of the most important things, because there are a lot of citizens in our country who already know who they will vote for.
Right.
And even before the election, you can easily predict it. Advertising works on those, persuadables in the middle. And the more well-known the candidates are, the less likely we should actually expect political advertising to matter, because there are so many other places that citizens can get their information. So I think putting those things together are important. But also the other reason why political advertising might be less influential than we think is that, at least in a presidential campaign, you're likely to have two very well-financed campaigns that are talking against each other. So there's this war on the airwaves. And in those conditions, when you have balanced information flows as opposed to one side, having the advantage, we would expect the effects to cancel each other out.
And of course, with well-known candidates, they will have a much larger political wallet to fund their campaigns and their advertising. So how much money would you say is spent on political ads or during an average election cycle nationally?
It's been going up every year. So, saying how much, like this year, the Harris campaign actually just came out and said that they have pre-booked $370 million on political advertising. Now, what's important about that was that they also said that $200 million of it was going to be on digital. And they define digital as digital and streaming. So part of that would be, feel more like a traditional television ad. It's not just social media advertising, but it's a lot of money.
That is a lot of money. And I think oftentimes when we have conversations like this, it's very focused on the national level, but also we'd love to know spending on the state level. Do we have a sense of, how much money goes into a gubernatorial race or even more local races? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. So I think the most important thing to know is that political advertising varies by how competitive the race is. So if you have a very competitive contest, obviously the spending is going to rise because both candidates are spending money, and you're more likely to attract outside groups that are trying to shape the balance of power across the country. It also matters where you are located. So Connecticut is an interesting case because we do have the Hartford media market, and a lot of spending for candidates here goes into that market, but it may or may not be a great fit with the residents of a particular district. So the residents of Southern Connecticut, those candidates have to make a decision about whether to go into airing ads in a New York media market, which is super expensive. And so most, congressional candidates would opt out of that. But we have seen candidates in Connecticut before, usually well-financed ones, that are willing to pay money to put ads in the New York media market to reach the residents of Southern Connecticut.
And do you have an idea of how much is spent here in Connecticut on political ads?
I don't have a number for you right now, but I would say in the past it varies wildly, again, depending on the competitiveness of the race and, like the upper ballot races cost more.
Right.
So, and they're reaching more citizens across the state. I think that I can tell you, in Connecticut's 5th district so far, like George Logan has spent maybe, $20,000 to $30,000 so far-ish.
And who is doing the spending? Are political campaigns spending the bulk, or are political action committees or PACs, spending on behalf of candidates? Can you help us break that down and understand that better?
For sure. So overall, candidates spend the most on political advertising, but that's in the full aggregate. And part of the reason is we have a lot of uncompetitive contests where only candidates would be spending money because the outcomes are really not very much in doubt. If you, though, look at the most competitive contest across the state, across the nation, you do tend to see high volumes of outside groups, pushing sometimes 40-50% of the advertising, which is really quite stunning.
And that number, I think, is a lot larger than I expected.
Yeah, I think on average, it ends up being like 30% is outside groups. But in the most competitive contests, you will find sometimes outside groups will out-air the candidates themselves.
Well, and because I think most of us have an idea that campaigns are expensive, but I think it still sort of blew my mind when I read into more details of how expensive these campaigns can be. Because so the 2020 election cycle, I believe, was the most expensive campaign year in history, totaling at least $2.5 billion just on TV ads. So how does this current election cycle compare to that one so far?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So in overall, spending on the 2024 election cycle is down from 2020, but that's in part because we had two very wealthy billionaires who were in the Democratic contest in 2020. So Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg spent an ungodly amount of money in their primaries. But even if we exclude them, we're still seeing a slight drop, at least in airings and in spending. But that's in part because, again, up until July 22nd, the race was between two very well-known incumbents, and you didn't see the Biden campaign was actually spending roughly equivalent to what it had spent last time around and in volumes. But the Trump campaign was off air, and so that matters, obviously, for a big portion of the summer. I think his campaign didn't feel the need to be advertising because they didn't have to. They were doing well in the polls without it, and why spend the money when you don't have to use it?
And just a quick reminder for our listeners that you can also join the conversation. Let us know if you're seeing a ton of ads for Harris or Trump right now. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And so we've been talking a lot about spending so much money on these campaigns. Who actually benefits the most from political ads? Are there certain kinds of candidates that these really help them out with?
I do think that political advertising is going to matter most when you have candidates who are not well defined. And that's in part because, people are not going to vote for someone that they don't know. Name recognition is one of the most important things, but I think even beyond name recognition, it's helpful to give citizens a reason to vote for you. So to contrast our two presumptive Democratic nominees in this cycle, everyone knows President Biden, very well familiar with him and his policies. People know Vice President Harris's name, but I don't think they know a lot about her personally. And so I think the advertising should be expected. And the reason why we've seen a huge ramp up in advertising since Biden dropped out of the race, including by former President Trump, is that there's a race to define who she is in the electorate.
Right, and sort of building on what you just said, we're finding ourselves in a very different kind of race in this moment. Certainly a couple weeks ago, this is not the election season that we thought we were going to go into, and now we're sort of in a different space. Right. So I'm really curious about the impact. What do we know about the goal of political ads, especially in this very unique experience that we're going through right now? Is it to convert voters, raise money, all of the above, or none of the above?
It is all of the above. I would say television is your place the primary goal of television advertising is to persuade. But a lot of the money that you'll see spent on the digital space and in social media is to raise money. That doesn't mean they aren't also trying to persuade, but they're different types of ads and different goals. I do think that a lot of the advertising that we'll see on the about Harris specifically right now, you heard it in the ads that you played at the beginning, are that, it's both to try to define who Harris is. So you have Harris is talking about her background, her middle-class background, the fact that she worked at McDonald's to try to raise her profile, but also drawing a sharp contrast between her and Donald Trump as being, she's for the middle class, Donald Trump is for himself and for billionaires. And then Donald Trump's campaign and his allies are both trying to tie her to the border and raising issues of public safety in particular.
So I do want to get to the tone of the ads in a little bit, but does the goal depend on if it's a TV or a digital ad?
It does. So most television ads they're persuadable. Their goal is main goal is persuasion, and that's in part because they are mass targeted. We can talk about, there are ways to target television ads in terms of you can buy ads on particular programs if you're seeking out different types of audiences. So your news audiences are obviously different than your daytime soap opera audiences and vice versa. And you can use the demographics of those audiences to try to tailor your message to different types of people. But obviously they're very different than because you really don't have control over who sees them beyond that rough demographics. But that's very different in the online context where you can be much more targeted about who you're trying to reach with what types of message. And so in the online environment, we do see a lot more fundraising appeals that are targeted specifically to partisans to help get them engaged, to turn out, to volunteer, and to give money.
And so, we're talking about the various ways that these ads can have an impact and how effective they are. But I'm really curious to hear, too, about the effectiveness, because does the effectiveness of an ad really spend on the ad itself? or elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it depends. So there's lots of different ways to measure effectiveness.
Right.
So I think that's one of the challenges, and it's also really hard in the heat of a campaign because you have lots of other messages happening at the same time. So political scientists wrestle with these challenges. I do think the best evidence that we have suggests that, and we can talk too about early versus late advertising and all of those sorts of strategy considerations. But I do think the best evidence that we have suggests that a robust and multifaceted campaign works better than one that is so, confined to any one medium, if that makes sense. You're trying to do all the things at the same time to raise your profile and to convince voters.
Well, I mean, you mentioned, later or earlier. What kind of impact do you see there, especially with this particular race?
Yeah, so this one is going to be really interesting because we have so much more of a compressed cycle. So usually it would be the case with a presidential nominee that they would be doing all their biographical spots, and usually those would be pure positive ones much earlier in the cycle. That's not what we're seeing now because there just isn't time. So the Harris campaign seems to be acknowledging she does have, and some of her group allies too, do have some purely positive spots by which we would define those that talk only about Harris. But the majority of them do that and draw a contrast between her and Donald Trump. So it's either positive or contrast, mostly on her side, and then the Trump campaign seems to be going all in on the negative and contrasting advertising.
Well, I wanted to ask you too. Does it matter if the ad is positive or negative? Like, do attack ads resonate with the average voter?
I'm not sure that they always resonate. Citizens will tell you that they hate negative advertising, but they are more likely to be remembered, and they're more likely to cause citizens to either pay more attention, seek out more information, or take action. And there's a reason why you see negative ads on the airwaves. I'd like to say that, we wouldn't want, even though citizens dislike negativity, we wouldn't want to live in a world of all purely positive advertising, because the pure positive spot typically has your candidate in a blue shirt, khaki pants, their family in a park, and invariably there's a golden retriever. The amount of substantive information that you would get out of that ad is that they're pro-puppy, pro-family, and they like the outdoors. And I don't know that really gives you a lot to decide between. So there is a value to contrast and negativity because it talks more about policy on average than your typical positive spot. But I do think that citizens get tired of the negativity, and especially the negativity that borders on mudslinging, which is, perceived to be more unfair attacks about individual characteristics.
Well, I think the average viewer always enjoy a pet.
Right. Oh, of course. Of course.
Well, and then we talked about earlier too, we sort of focused the conversation about television ads, and we played a clip earlier with Dwight Eisenhower with the first television advertising campaign, but that was during the 50s and the 60s. So assuming there's been a lot of evolving since then. So we're seeing ads now on all kinds of screens, websites, social media platforms, and more. So can you talk about that evolution, since the 50s and the 60s? So how has that changed?
Yeah, there's been a lot of evolution and a lot of growth in both just acknowledgement of the multi-screen nature of American politics. I mean, today you can't really escape them, right? The number of screens that you have will probably determine how likely you are to see some. But even, you go to the gas pump in swing states and you're still likely to see some or hear some political advertising in those venues as well. So I think the growth is really, it's two things. It is both more advertising overall, but it's also a more variety of platforms. And campaigns have gotten really creative over time in how they do that. I mean, there have been examples in the past of using video games and finding ways to put in political signs into the video games to help raise awareness among audiences that might not otherwise be engaged, which is, that is, I think, the way that paid advertising really does help the American electorate is in paying attention. Hey, there's an election going on. We're going to find you wherever you are, right? Instead of just letting the viewers come to them, because it's a smaller proportion of the electorate that is really engaged. There's a lot of citizens who don't pay that much attention to politics.
Well, and then with that kind of evolution too over the decades, we've definitely seen so many changes in this new landscape of political advertising. Can you talk about, are there any restrictions or regulations in relation to that? Because it's so wide now. When we went from just sort of quote, just on TV to all kinds of different platforms today. Are there any limits, or what are the limits like in political ads and where they can be advertised?
Yeah, so the limits are varied, and I will say that television is the most regulated space that we have right now, and that is really interesting, and it's really hard as a researcher actually to get insight and transparency into other spaces. We were fortunate enough after the 2016 campaign, when there was concern about dark money in elections and contributions in the online space in particular, that two of the largest platforms and some of the smaller ones put out their own ad libraries, because it gives us more transparency into what's happening in the digital space. But it's still the case, streaming advertising is a huge growth area for political ads right now. And most of the streaming places, we actually don't know how many ads are airing or what's the distribution of those airings, because they don't have similar disclosure requirements like television and other things. Candidates and groups that talk about campaigns and political candidates for office have to disclose their spending if it's within particular windows. So, within 60 days of a general election or 30 days of a primary, if you're spending money on television, you have to disclose that to the Federal Election Commission. But there's a reason why you'll see some of that, dark money spending, for example, is more prominent usually before those windows open than it is after. It's not necessarily that the dark money advertisers are not advertising, they just go to different spaces to do it.
Another quick question before we go to break is, I think something that most of us have heard and continue to hear is, where did the "and I approve this message" language come from in political ads?
Yeah, so it's a federal election law, and it was the candidates have to stand by their advertising in the televised space. It wasn't a requirement on the digital space because there again are fewer regulations in that space. Interestingly, the goal of, and this is true of a lot of campaign finance reform law, that the goal of adding the I approval was intended to remove some negativity from the airwaves, and you can tell how well that's worked given the cycle that we're in. But yeah, the goal was, reformers thought that if they had candidates say, "I'm Erica Franklin Fowler and I approve this message," that they might be less likely to air an attack before or after it, and that I don't think has panned out quite the way they hoped.
Well, coming up, we'll be speaking more with Erica Franklin Fowler of the Wesleyan Media Project. Let us know if you have any questions for her about political ads or media literacy. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
Everyone, the day is up for everyone to please it out and vote. You wanna have security, wanna have security, you gotta get out and vote. They're growing big red apples that Hoover is promoting. If you don't wanna sell those apples, start voting, man, start voting. Oh, get behind the president, get behind the president. We wanna win the war, right behind the president.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're looking at political advertising during the 2024 election and what it means for how people might vote this November. Still with us is Erica Franklin Fowler, who's a professor of government at Wesleyan University and co-director of the Wesleyan Media Project. And listeners, let us know, what kind of messages are you seeing in political ads? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Eric, I want to dive into some of the political ads that we're seeing this election cycle. Kamala Harris officially entered the presidential race a few weeks ago, but can you talk about what has been the strategy of her campaign so far? What kind of messaging are we seeing in her ads?
Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, the real goal of her ads right now is both to define her as a person, as a prosecutor and someone who is tough, but also who is from the middle class with middle class roots and is going to fight for middle class people. So that's really what you're seeing is sort of those two strategies, both rebuttals from the attacks that she's receiving from the Trump campaign in terms of, they're going after her as dangerous and weak, and she's countering that with, I'm a tough prosecutor and I've gone after these criminals for a variety of things, but then also, that additional important biographical information about who she is, where she comes from, and what her values are.
And here's one recent political ad from the Harris campaign.
The one thing Kamala Harris has always been: fearless. As a prosecutor, she put murderers and abusers behind bars. As California's Attorney General, she went after the big banks and won $20 billion for homeowners. And as Vice President, she took on the big drug companies to cap the cost of insulin for seniors.
This campaign is about who we fight for. We believe in a future where every person has the opportunity not just to get by, but to get ahead, where every senior can retire with dignity.
Erica, what are some thoughts from the ad that we just heard? It sort of echoes some of the points that you made earlier.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think they're both. So women face a double bind in politics often, and as females tend to be seen as more soft, if that makes sense. So I think one of the things the Harris campaign is trying to do is play up her background as a prosecutor, going after the banks, going after the criminals. And I think that is part of the strategy here, in part to bolster her credentials on that front. But also you hear it very clearly in the values and, like who this campaign is about, who we fight for. And she doesn't use it in that particular turn of phrase, but you can hear the "for the people" slogan tagline sort of embodied in the creative there.
And that totality sort of frames like the fearless framing.
Right, exactly.
So Donald Trump's campaign has had a bit more runway with political advertising, of course. And overall, what kind of rhetoric are we seeing in his ads this year?
Yeah, so his ads are sort of taking two tacks right now. Most of them do tend to bring in immigration in some way, shape, or form, because that is a top issue for voters if you ask them. But he's also attacking Kamala for the extent to which she has let out criminals and doing other sorts of things. So it's again, that being soft on crime, being dangerous, being weak. And then the other tagline that they're using a lot, which is not a surprise given where she comes from, is radical and liberal. So lots of those, words that are tend to have more negative associations for especially conservatives, but even some, people in the middle trying to attach those labels to her specifically.
And how does it compare to his past presidential runs? Are you seeing a big difference, or is it kind of, evolving different ways?
It's a really good question. I think the big difference we're seeing, and you can see it in this election cycle, is that he really was not advertising on television. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing a huge ramp up in the attacks. But the attack, the two ways I would say that the attacks are different. We saw a big focus on crime and public safety in the last presidential election over the summer. He really turned to that heavily before he sort of came back to the more bread and butter issues of the economy in 2020. So the discussion of crime and even immigration, frankly, is not really that new. But I do think what is new, and some of the ads, they actually, I'm not sure they're from his campaign specifically. They may be the groups that are supporting him. But there are undertones of an echoing of like Willie Horton-esque advertising, where they're really, trying to tie the vice president to these dangerous criminals and being responsible for dangerous criminals and therefore crime in society. And I do think that, those attacks tend to be racialized for obvious reasons. And the Harris campaign, I think, is doing a good job of trying to counter that with her own messaging to, again, talk about the ways in which she's gone after drugs, drug gangs and other things across the border.
Well, you mentioned the name Willie Horton. Can you expand on that a little bit, just for listeners who might not know what that is?
So it goes back to the 1980s. There was an ad that was run that basically tried to tie a Democratic candidate to a criminal who had been released. And the ad, played with a revolving door and the picture of Willie Horton, who was a black man who had been let out and did some terrible things. This type of appeal is known as a implicit racial appeal, in part because it features a way of trying to tie a candidate to racialized crime and negative stereotypes. There is a whole wide and good literature on the racialization of politics, and we've seen, increasing amounts of it. Obviously, Donald Trump is one of the key characters who has made these. It's not really implicit anymore. I would say it's very explicit racialized attacks. But there is also a literature that talks about how to counter that, and it seems that the Harris campaign is either familiar with it or is very good naturally at trying to counter it.
And here we're going to listen from one recent political ad from the Trump campaign.
Illegal immigrant, convicted, released, then violently fractured a woman's skull. Who released every one of them? Liberal DA Kamala Harris. The victim's blood is on her hands.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Eric, I want to ask your opinion about that.
That's a great example. Yeah, so that one was aired by the Trump campaign. So yes, I think that is a good example of a Willie Horton-esque appeal. It's talking specifically about specific criminals who have been let out and done terrible things, and then trying to place the blame specifically on the opponent.
Well, we've been talking a lot about impacts and effectiveness of political ads. How effective is the anti-immigrant rhetoric in Trump's ads?
So I think it does tie into concerns and fears about both. It's both a border issue, but it's also an economic issue because you hear from citizens, who are feeling the sting of inflation and to some extent, unemployment. Even if they themselves are not out of work, they're familiar with some people who are, and so I think that does tie into concerns in the American public. I do think that the core of those that ad that you specifically played is really less about immigration per se and more about the general sense of unease and concern in society. And I do think that the Harris campaign, again, the way that they're trying to counter it is to really go after. She was a prosecutor who went after these things as a way of countering the attack.
Well, and we just heard a very small sample of the two campaigns and the ads that they have aired and talking about some of the themes. The Wesleyan Media Project actually tracks which issues are mentioned in political ads. And in 2024, which issues are showing up more?
So the top issues in the presidential race right now are public safety and immigration, which is no surprise because both the Trump campaign is going heavily after it, but also Harris is trying to counter those messages. So the two of those together will raise the profile of those specific issues. I do think, and the Trump campaign is really honing in on them. So the majority of their ads right now are about those two topics. The Harris campaign is actually advertising on a much wider range of issues, and one of the notable ones for me this cycle is housing. I haven't seen housing in the list of top priorities or top issues for a presidential candidate maybe ever in our 20-year span of data. So I think that's really important. She's also talking about healthcare. She's talking about, cost of living explicitly, and groceries specifically are really something that is coming up a lot. And then the other two issues that, before I forget, are opioids and fentanyl. Both campaigns are talking about that issue, and then inflation.
So why do you think housing in this election cycle? And also, we were also just thinking too, something that I feel that's missing is talking about the economy, considering it's in the news. They do talk about it, but not necessarily in their ads.
Yeah, so I think housing and healthcare and cost of living are all, can be economic issues. So I think they are talking about it, but not in the same way that we tend to see the bread and butter. It's the economy. Like in Bill Clinton's line of it's the economy, stupid. Usually we tend to see those and jobs being top of the list. And they are not being talked about as much this year. I think housing is one. I think partly, Kamala Harris comes from California, and so housing is a really important issue there. But it's not just there. Connecticut has its own issues with housing, and I think it is, rising as an economic issue for a lot of voters because they simply can't afford the cost of housing, the cost of groceries, so it's a way of talking about economic issues with maybe in being more specific to the actual specific concerns citizens. But yeah, it was a surprise for me. Healthcare and abortion were not a surprise, right? Those have been on the docket for quite a while, and we expect Democratic politicians this cycle to be hammering home on the abortion issue because it's a good one for them. But these other issues were more surprising to me anyway.
And for our listener, just a quick reminder that you can join the conversation. Let us know if you have any questions for Erica. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So earlier we talked a little bit about spending as well, and I'm curious to hear, do you know if there are any special interest groups or PACs that have been spending big on either Trump or Harris?
Yeah, there are a couple. I wish I had the list right in front of me. FF PAC is airing on behalf of the Harris campaign, and then the Trump campaign has a couple too. Make America Great Again is one of them in particular that's been active, but there are a couple more on both sides that have been active. The percentages, by the way, Trump has more outside groups supporting him right now. I think it's it's over half of his advertising is sponsored by outside groups, a much smaller proportion supporting Harris, but still, it's over 25% of the ads that are for her on air on television are from outside groups.
Well, I'm also curious to hear, where do we see these political ads the most? Like in the presidential race, for example, are voters in most states exposed to ads, or is there a focus on battleground states?
Definitely a focus on battleground states. So one of the things about residents of Connecticut right now are probably not seeing a lot of presidential ads on their television screens unless they're watching national cable spots, which will be airing because both campaigns are using a mix of those. But the majority of the television ads will be, honed in and targeted on the swing states that are going to be particularly important. So, of course, lots of advertising in Pennsylvania and in Michigan and Wisconsin, and even Arizona. So a lot of those places are going to, they literally cannot escape the presidential cycle. The rest of us, especially if you live here in Connecticut, will encounter it on your feeds. If you're really active partisan, you're likely seeing ads from both sides. And probably if you are a partisan, you're more likely to see fundraising appeals than you are anything else. But there will be also, like an engagement of trying to get voters to come volunteer for the campaigns, to go see candidates at various events, again, designed to fundraise. And then the more persuadable voters might see an occasional spot here and there that is attempting to court them to their side. But fewer in Connecticut then, because we are a blue state. We're not going to see as much of the campaign as we would if we were living elsewhere.
Well, and really quickly here, because we talked about how political ads have gone from TV to various screens, like our social media and digital. Can you talk about strategies behind that? Who decides where goes where?
Yeah, so part of it is campaigns make strategic decisions about where the audiences are. So television is still an important place to advertise, even though a lot of people like us may not have linear TV in our homes anymore. Sure. But they're still important because older voters are a core demographic, and they really need to motivate those citizens to get out to the polls. So television will be a core place for that reason. But streaming is also important in that way because, they're attempting to reach, live audiences wherever they can. And then the digital space, obviously, citizens, as we said, don't get, their news. They get their news from a wide variety of places. And so the goal of campaigns is really just to reach you wherever you are. So trying to figure out where and when you can grab attention is part of the goal of any presidential campaign, any campaign, really.
Well, we hope this conversation is keeping your attention. After a short break, Erica Franklin Fowler of the Wesleyan Media Project will share some advice for improving our media literacy skills in 2024. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
Up to you. Kennedy, 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 Kennedy for me. Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we've been unpacking how political campaigns use ads to get their messages across and persuade voters. We're going to continue that conversation now, plus get into how we might think more critically about those messages in political ads, but also on social media and even in the news we consume. And still with us is Erica Franklin Fowler, who's a professor of government at Wesleyan University and co-director of the Wesleyan Media Project. So we've been talking about lots of campaigns nationally, but kind of want to bring it back to local here in Connecticut. One of the big races to watch is the 5th Congressional District. Congresswoman Jahana Hayes has a rematch with Republican George Logan. Let's take a quick listen to both of their candidates' ads.
The sacrifice of our veterans can never be fully repaid, and we must deliver the benefits they've earned. I passed legislation to support Gold Star families, increase access to mental health services, and improve care. That's why my office was named the only Purple Heart Office of Distinction in all of New England.
I'm George Logan. Too many politicians think compromise is a dirty word, but that hasn't made your life any easier. Look, I'm the son of Guatemalan immigrants and a proud family man. I'll never compromise my values, but I will compromise to put money back in your pocket. I'm running for Congress to bring people together and get Washington working for you.
Erica, thoughts on the two ads here?
Yeah, so I think they both are doing the same thing, which is trying to play to the middle. So you see Congresswoman Hayes talking about the Gold Star families as being a way to try to court the more conservative, pro-military in the state. And then George Logan is doing something similar to what he did last cycle, which was, people always want to put me in a box, right? So he's trying to fight we do live in a blue state, and even that district, even though it is more hotly contested, he still has to bring over, Democratic voters in order to win the ticket. So trying to talk about compromise, and being a compromise politician is in part that goal of playing to the middle. So both of them, you can hear it in their appeals there, going after the persuadable folks in the center.
Well, and with the amount of information that's exposed and the amount of information and news that we consume, I think the ongoing conversation is the fact that mis and disinformation has become very common in certain types of media. And they both refer to false information, but disinformation is deliberate and misinformation can be inadvertent. So how much mis or disinformation do we see in political ads?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a really hard thing to measure, in part because the goal of paid advertising generally is to paint yourself in the best possible light, right? And so there are different ways in which a candidate or a campaign could do that. They can use different time periods or different other things to make them sound better than they might be otherwise. So the paid advertising, I think it is really a discourse between the candidates. And typically, if you have one candidate come out with a really exaggerated claim, if it's a competitive contest, the other one will call them on it. So the good news in paid advertising is that it does tend to be this back and forth. I think the harder piece is when you are encountering mis or disinformation in your social media feed or whatever. You don't necessarily see the rebuttal, the counter to it right away. There are some great strategies that can be used, I think, to help citizens, tamp down both the amount of disinformation that they see, but also the spread of it specifically. And so thinking about how to, don't share things until you're sure that it's from a valid source or you're sure that it is correct is another important piece. Some of the platform companies have actually come up with, if you try to retweet or reshare or repost information, some of them will nudge you and say, "Are you sure?" And that even just that little nudge often causes people to think twice before they spread information.
Well, and then encountering new technology too. I think this is two questions and one big question is, as technology has shifted, are we seeing more artificial intelligence contribute to misleading narratives or visuals and ads? And I'm thinking also about the rise of deep fakes. And also with this shift, are there rules and regulations in this space?
There are none yet. And I think it is a concern for voters. I think it's also a concern generally. I mean, frankly, I'm surprised we haven't seen more of it in earlier cycles. But obviously, it's so much more prolific now. I think one of the biggest concerns, frankly, is not even so much the use, because Trump has already put out artificial intelligence images of Harris in front of fake backgrounds. I think one of the biggest concerns, though, is not even so much the use of it, but the fact that it exists gives citizens a reason to be distrustful of all information. And I think that is actually perhaps an even bigger danger because it causes us to tune out information that could be that is high quality from high quality news sources. So I think we have a responsibility as a public to not just talk about the mis and disinformation, but also to talk about the sources that should be trusted.
Well, and actually, speaking of the sources, I want to ask too, how should we think about the way media literacy has shifted depending on the information source? You see a video, Do you question all the videos? Like, should we be asking the same questions about information that we're seeing in political ads as we're hearing on NPR, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think political ads are always something that you should be slightly skeptical about because they tend to come from motivated sources intentionally. The good news is that most political ads are easier to pick out, and that citizens typically have the cues to at least acknowledge that is a paid spot. If it's not properly labeled, that's where you would get into trouble, and the online spaces are harder in that way. A lot of the platforms now have their own policies. They're not federal regulation, but they are platform policies that require disclaimers and content, which is important. But when they don't have them, the blurring of the lines between what is a paid or a motivated piece of messaging and actual fact is important.
We got a couple minutes left here, but I do want to talk about, in recent years, there's been some states that have enacted laws requiring media literacy education. Is it important to start that when we're younger?
I do think it is important to start when we're younger, and I do think the evidence suggests that it is really important and helpful. And I think, even my own students in the public schools here have been taught to do what's called lateral reading, which is shown to help that when you encounter a piece of information, you can go to the web and look it up. And the more sources you see reporting that information, especially from high quality sources, can increase your confidence in the piece of information that you're seeing. But I also will say that most of the academic evidence doesn't actually suggest that it's the youngest audiences that have the biggest issue with this. It's actually the oldest audiences who are more likely to fall for mis and disinformation.
Well, I guess alongside with that, are there different types of questions that we should ask when we're analyzing and then evaluating a media message?
Yeah, I think I would pay attention to two things. One is, who is the source, and are they somebody that you trust? Also, are they who they say they are? And on some platforms, it's become harder to actually, be sure. A lot of the platforms had, blue checks, for example, that used to signify that you were a verified source, and some of them still have that, but it's becoming harder on some platforms. And then the other thing is, is the piece of information that you're interested in, is it being carried in multiple outlets? That's usually a good indication that this is indeed verified.
And also, given all that we've discussed today, if you were to be creating a political ad for a candidate, what's your approach? What are some of the essential ingredients that you would include with that?
Yeah, it probably depends on what your goal is and the timing and what issues you're trying to speak to. It's a complicated issue, but I would say that, I have some students at Wesleyan who, they spent so much time watching political ads and then reading the academic literature about elite messengers. And they were like, there's a big disconnect here because so many ads actually have ordinary Americans carrying that message. And so I do think there is a benefit to using citizens who are like you and I in advertising to speak to other citizens like us.
We've got about a minute left here, but we'd love to know too, what do we need to do more to improve media literacy in the U.S.? I mean, we have so much more information now available at our fingertips, literally say, 5-10 years ago. What are some things that we need to look into?
It's really true. I mean, I think media literacy generally is a great place to start, but I also will say that, we as individuals can only do so much. I do think it is incumbent upon the platforms. And to some extent, if they won't police themselves, then that is the place for regulators to come in and help, ensure that our spaces, our public forums, whether they be on social media apps that are not necessarily public, are still safe for users and carry valid information.
Well, I'm excited to have you back on when you have data from our latest race, because I think that'll be a very interesting conversation to have down the road.
Yeah.
Major thanks to Erica Franklin Fowler of the Wesleyan Media Project for joining us this hour. Thank you so much, Erica, for spending time with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Meg Dalton. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.